Welcome to a new chapter in the world of historical mysteries. The story of the dancing plague in Strasbourg is not just an ancient legend, but one of the strangest and most tragic events in recorded history. Imagine a town where people could not stop dancing, not for joy, but for an irresistible urge, until their hearts stopped beating. Today, we will explore that mystery together. In the last days of July, 1518, on the banks of the quiet Ill River, the peaceful town of Strasbourg was immersed in a soothing sleep. The half-timbered houses, covered with old slate, leaned against each other like a flock of sheep huddled in the wind, and the cobblestone streets, which were noisy all day, now echoed only with the heavy footsteps of the night watchman. It was said that these houses had witnessed the vicissitudes of an era, but no one, not the oldest or the most agile child, could have foreseen the strange things that were about to happen. Lisette, a young girl with braided brown hair and hazel eyes, had just finished folding the last wool blanket on her loom. She sighed, relaxing her tired shoulders after a long day of work. Outside, the church bells rang 3 times, signaling the stroke of midnight. Unlike any other night, there was a heavy feeling, an unusual silence in the air. Even the chirping of crickets had become sparse. Her father, an old baker named Klaus, was fast asleep behind the warm coal stove. Her mother, Helga, was still awake, sitting by the window knitting, her eyes staring out into space, as if waiting for something. The next morning, the sun rose over the horizon, dyeing the church spires red. Everything seemed normal. But then, on the small cobblestone street leading to the square, a woman was seen. It was Frau Troffea, the wife of the village carpenter, a woman known for her quiet disposition and sad face. But today, she was no longer sad. She was dancing. At first, no one paid any attention. They assumed she was drunk, or simply in a rare moment of passion. But she did not stop. She danced alone, without music, without words, only her heavy, panting breaths echoed in the still morning air. Her face did not express joy, but rather anguish, an irresistible urge. Lisette, from her window, watched her and felt an invisible chill run down her spine. It was unlike any dance she had ever seen. By midday, a few curious people had gathered. At first they laughed, then they were curious, and finally they were afraid. They tried to shake her, tried to pull her into a corner to rest, but in vain. Frau Troffea pushed their hands away, continued to dance, her feet spinning endlessly, as if controlled by some invisible string. People began to whisper about a curse, about an evil spirit that had possessed her. The second day, then the third, Frau Troffea continued to dance. Her wooden shoes were broken, her feet were swollen and bleeding, but she did not stop. Her dancing became more frantic, more violent, like a cornered animal. And then, something even stranger happened. A man, who had been watching all afternoon, suddenly began to convulse and dance along. Then an old woman, then a child. And so the strange dancing began to spread. In no time, the square had become a demonic dance hall. Dozens of people were dancing together, in a dance that was completely out of sync. Panting, wooden shoes clattering against stone, and painful moans echoed endlessly, forming a demonic harmony. They danced under the scorching sun, they danced under the twinkling stars, they did not eat, they did not sleep, they just danced. At first, the priests and town officials thought it was a strange fever, a plague that needed to be cured. The mayor, a fat and vain man, ordered musicians to bring out their instruments, thinking that the music would help the sick people dance away their fever. But this was a terrible mistake. The music and drums only made the dancing more intense, more frenzied, and more importantly, it attracted more people, who were also drawn into the same demonic vortex. In her house, Lisette sat next to her father, who had been swept away by the strange plague. His eyes were wide open, no longer recognizing her. His old feet, accustomed to standing next to the brazier, now stomped on the wooden floor, making eerie noises. Every time he danced, the whole house shook. Her mother, Helga, cried out, trying to hold her husband, but in vain. The dancing had turned the gentle father into a monster without emotions, only able to move endlessly. The whole town had now become a nightmare. Anyone who passed by was in danger of being drawn into this deadly dance. The strong, the old, the weak, the children, everyone danced. Horrifying noises from the square, from the streets, from the houses, rang out day and night, like a hellish song. Lisette, now faced alone with Helga, felt completely helpless. She could do nothing to save her father, nor could she help her neighbors. They were all caught up in this strange plague, and there was no explanation. People talked about a curse from a forgotten goddess, about unjust souls buried underground, but no one had any proof, and it was all just ghost stories passed down by word of mouth. Lisette looked at her father, who had fallen to the floor, exhausted. But then, after a moment, he stood up again, and began to dance again, mechanically and painfully. She knew that if he continued like this, he would not survive. This dance was not a dance of life, but a dance of death. She wondered if there was a power that could free them from this nightmare, or if they would be forever trapped in the dance of a mad town. Lisette and Helga sat in the small kitchen. The ticking of the grandfather clock on the wall seemed to be drowned out by the town's mad cacophony. The sound of her father, Klaus, hitting the floor had faded, but it was still an unbearable sound. Her father had been dancing for 3 days and 3 nights, and now he was a shadow of himself. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his steps were now just unconscious jerks, but the will of the plague did not let him go. Helga gripped Lisette's hand tightly, her nails digging into her flesh. "I don't understand, my child," she said, trembling. "What curses have befallen us? I have always prayed, I have always lived a virtuous life, but why did God let this happen?" Tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks. Lisette could only squeeze her mother's hand, helplessness and fear overwhelming her. She had believed that faith could dispel all darkness, but now, in the face of this plague, all her faith was shattered. A moment later, the footsteps outside became frantic and frantic. Lisette and her mother looked through the window. A group of people were running down the street, their faces pale with terror. They kept looking back as they ran, as if something invisible was chasing them. From the square, screams and groans rose louder than ever, accompanied by the sound of objects crashing. Things were getting worse. faster than they thought. "We can't stay here forever," Lisette whispered. "Father. He'll die." She looked at her father, who had fallen again and was struggling to get up. A daring thought flashed through her mind. "I'll go get help." Helga panicked. "Where do you want to go?" "It's not safe out there." But Lisette was determined. She couldn't just sit there and watch her father die. She had to do something. Lisette pulled on an old woolen cloak, the hood fastened to hide her face. Her mother handed her a loaf of bread and a small bottle of water. Before she left, she hugged her mother tightly. "I'll be back soon," she said, her voice choked. "I'll find a way to save Dad." Her mother just nodded, her eyes red and filled with utter fear. Lisette opened the door and stepped outside. The cold night air hit her in the face, carrying with it the screams and the terrifying sounds of the plague. The street was now a maze of tormented souls. Men and women, children and old people, all dancing. Some had collapsed, their faces ashen and their bodies shaking. Others were still dancing, but their faces were expressionless, like wooden dolls being pulled by some invisible force. Lisette dodged them, her heart pounding in her chest. Where should she go? Who could help her? She thought of Friar Anselm, the old priest of the cathedral. He was a learned man, having studied in the great monasteries of Italy. She believed he might have the answer. The cathedral was in the center of town, but to get there she had to cross the square. She took a deep breath and began to run. The square, once the bustling heart of the town, was now a scene of hell. Hundreds of people were dancing wildly. The smell of sweat, blood, and death filled her nostrils. The mayor's musicians were gone, but the drums and trumpets still echoed in the minds of the sick, urging them to dance to death. She saw a fat man sprawled on the ground, his face purple. She recognized him as the mayor, who had made a bad decision. A woman with wild hair and bulging eyes rushed towards her. Lisette jumped back in panic, but the woman paid no attention to her. She frantically jumped over her and continued to rush towards the crowd. Lisette recognized it as Frau Troffea. The plague had turned the once sad woman into a mindless monster. Lisette ran faster, past the dancing people and the fallen bodies, and finally she reached the church. The huge, heavy wooden doors were closed. She pounded on the door, but there was no answer. She pounded harder, calling Anselm's name. "Please, Anselm. Open the door," she begged. After a while, a small window in the door opened. The old eyes of the monk Anselm appeared, looking at her suspiciously. "Lisette? What are you doing here? It's hell out there. Are you infected?" Lisette shook her head. "No, sir. I came to ask for your help. My father, he's dying. Can you help us?" The monk sighed. "I don't have the power to fight the devil, my child. I can only pray." Lisette did not give up. She told him of what she had seen, of the dead, of the despair of the town. She begged him not to just pray, but to act. After a moment of silence, Friar Anselm opened the door. "Come in, my child. I may not have the power to fight the devil, but I may have an answer." Inside the church, the air was eerily quiet. The screams outside seemed swallowed up by the thick stone walls. Monk Anselm led her to a small room, filled with books and old scrolls. He lit a candle and began to rummage through them. "I have read many books," he said, his voice low and weary, "about strange plagues, about unseen spirits, about unseen forces." He pulled out an old, leather-bound book and turned the yellowed pages. "Here," he pointed to a picture of dancing people, "is an old story about a forgotten god. The god of dancing. It is said that when he was forgotten, he would curse his worshippers, forcing them to dance until they died." Lisette listened, her eyes wide. "So, is it a curse?" Monk Anselm nodded. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it is a form of punishment. But the only way to break it is not through prayer, not through music, but through acceptance. Acceptance and surrender to it." He explained that in order to break the curse, they needed someone who could dance with all those who were cursed, someone who could lead them in one last dance, a dance of liberation. Lisette looked out at the square, at the suffering souls, and she knew she had to do something. Although she was afraid, a glimmer of hope was kindled in her heart. She would be the last to dance, to save her town. Lisette had fallen asleep in Anselm's study, fitful and exhausted after a long night of struggle. His words still echoed in her head, of a dance of liberation, of a forgotten God. When she woke, the morning light was filtering through the small window, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. The church bells had rung 6 times, and from outside, the groans of pain and the stamping of feet still came in, but they seemed a little fainter, the faintness of those who were exhausted. Monk Anselm was waiting for her. He had changed into a pure white robe, and in his hand he held a laurel wreath woven from green olive branches. "Daughter," he said, his voice deep and determined, "this is not a dance of death, but a dance of life. You must dance with all faith, with all acceptance. Only then can you save them." He handed her the laurel wreath and a white robe like his own. "Wear it. It will be your shield against the desperate souls." Lisette put on her cloak, feeling a strange sense of peace. She clutched the wreath tightly, taking a deep breath. She was no longer afraid. Fear had been replaced by an iron will, a boundless determination. She knew that she was entering a battle, not with swords, but with her own body and soul. She would dance, not for herself, but for her father, for her mother, and for all the people in the town who were tormented by the curse. As the church doors opened, the morning light flooded in, illuminating her face. Lisette stepped out and headed straight for the square. The scene outside had not changed, if anything, it had gotten worse. Hundreds of people were dancing, but now their faces were completely lifeless, like wooden masks. Some had collapsed, but were still unconsciously trying to lift their feet. The smell of death had begun to permeate the air. Lisette stood in the middle of the square, alone, like a lighthouse in a stormy ocean. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to dance. Her dance was not as frantic as theirs. It was slow, gentle, like a spring breeze. She raised her arms, slowly twirling, each step a rhythm of life. She did not dance to any music, she danced to the beat of her heart, a beat of faith and hope. At first, no one paid any attention to her. They continued their own dance, in their own world. But then, a few people began to notice the difference. An old man, who had been dancing for 5 days and 5 nights, suddenly stopped. His sunken eyes looked at Lisette, as if he was seeing something long forgotten. He trembled, trying to imitate her dance steps. And then a child, with swollen legs and a pale face, stopped too. He looked at her, his clear eyes seemingly coming back to life. He too began to dance after Lisette, his baby steps trying to keep pace with her. 1, then 2, then 3. Gradually, a circle of the recovering began to form around Lisette, forming an oasis of peace in a sea of madness. Lisette's dancing became a prayer, a mantra. She no longer felt tired. Each step seemed to draw strength from some invisible source, an energy that came from faith and hope. She danced, and those around her danced too. Their dance was no longer a dance of torment, but a dance of release. It was like an ancient ritual, one that everyone in town, willingly or not, had to participate in. The sun began to set, dyeing the church spires red. Dozens of people joined in Lisette's dance. Though many others were still dancing frantically in the distance, a glimmer of hope had been rekindled. The plague seemed to have found an opponent, not in swords or prayers, but in a dance of kindness and courage. Lisette danced without stopping, a rhythm of life, gentle and steady. Night fell again, and the silver moonlight replaced the yellow light of the evening. Those who had joined her circle were no longer exhausted. A strange peace reigned in their souls. An old man, who had danced the most wildly, now sat down, embracing his granddaughter. His eyes were no longer empty, but filled with tears of relief. The panting of the dancers in the distance had faded. The plague had lost its initial ferocity. Many had collapsed, not from death, but from the exhaustion of a dance that had lost its impulse. They lay there, on the cold stone floor, their faces peaceful. A few had woken up, looking around in shock, unable to believe what had happened. Lisette, her white robes now covered in dirt, finally stopped. She had been dancing for a day and a night, but she did not feel tired. She looked around, at the people waking up, the faces coming back to life. A woman, Frau Troffea, who had started it all, was now lying on the ground, her eyes closed, but her breathing steady. The plague had left her. Monk Anselm emerged from the church, a white porcelain pitcher in his hand. He walked over to Lisette and handed her a sip of water. "You did it," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You defeated the devil with a dance of forgiveness and compassion." Lisette nodded, unable to speak. Her lips were dry, but her heart was full of gratitude. News of Strasbourg's deliverance quickly spread throughout the surrounding countryside. People from other towns still haunted by similar curses and plagues came. They came not to dance, but to hear Lisette's story, to see the people who had been saved. Lisette became a symbol of hope, a quiet heroine of a tumultuous time. The plague ended, but the wounds it left behind could never be erased. Many died of exhaustion and hunger. But more importantly, a change took place in each person's heart. They learned that not all curses can be solved by violence or prayer, but sometimes, it requires acceptance, forgiveness, and a loving heart. And the story of the dancing plague became a legend, passed down from generation to generation. It is said that on full moon nights, on the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg, one can still hear the soft footsteps of a woman dancing, a dance of life, a dance of liberation. And those who listen to those footsteps will be blessed with peace and courage.